she can match the siren. It's all right. So we'll get. Yeah, go ahead. We'll get started. I know we have a number of people who've joined already, and I assume we'll have some more joining over the time we have. We've given an hour to this important discussion. We know that's not enough to tackle it, but we wanted to be respectful of people's time in the middle of a workday, including Rabbi Hirsch's. Let me give a little bit of background on what today, how today came about, and then we'll get into our discussion. I'll introduce our speaker. So months ago, Marty Cohen, who's here, there are a couple people here in the room with me, that Marty Cohen raised the question that we really need to look at anti-Semitism in a more serious way as Jews. We as Jews are not paying enough attention and not learning enough about the anti-Semitism of the 21st century. We know a lot about the Holocaust. We know a lot about what anti-Semitism looked like in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But anti-Semitism looks differently now, and we need to really do a deep dive. And that turned into our series on anti-Semitism, which began with a session with the American Jewish Committee, in which we talked broadly about anti-Semitism as it is today and how large Jewish institutions like the AJC and synagogues in the Jewish community are understanding anti-Semitism. We talked about how to even, our goal in that session was, how do you even define anti-Semitism today? That's something that's debated. And so we worked on what the definition of anti-Semitism is and how do you notice it. Our second session was with Hillel professionals. We talked about anti-Semitism on campus. What are the concerns of our students? What perhaps should be the concerns of our students that might not be the concerns of our students? And how do we prepare our students? Today is our last official session, because we know this is not the end of this dialogue, but our last session in this series is with Rabbi Hirsch, and our topic is the progressive Zionist Jew, a contradiction in terms. So today we really want to tackle the idea of how can we be progressive Jews. I think each of those titles could perhaps stand on its own. But how do we take on all of these three titles? How can I be a progressive, Jewish, and Zionist? And perhaps at some point those three terms were synonymous, and it seems as though, as Rabbi Hirsch's title suggests, maybe they're not synonymous, obviously synonymous anymore. So a little bit on our guest, and then we'll turn it to him. Rabbi Hirsch is the senior rabbi of Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in New York City, where he's led a dramatic revival in Jewish life. He is recognized internationally for his leadership in Jewish affairs and is frequently cited in the media. He's included among the 50 most influential Jews of the year by the Jerusalem Post. And there's good reason for that. Not only is it wonderful to have a colleague who gets noticed for his achievements, but it's also because he's done great work. He served for 12 years as the executive director of ARTZA, the Association of Reform Zionists of America, which is our Zionist arm as a reform movement. He's the author of One People, Two Worlds, a book that I continue to have on my shelf and have referred to many times, which was, what year was that published, Rabbi Hirsch?
That was 2002, 20 years ago.
I was going to say it's about 20 years old. So it was a great dialogue, something that I think a lot of us pride ourselves on, which is certainly in Akron, our relationship with our Orthodox partners and friends, and the book is a great dialogue. So One People, Two Worlds, he was a co-author of that, and he received his ordination from Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in New York, and also has a law degree from the London School of Economics, is a member of the New York State Bar. Perhaps for our talk today, a point that should be underlined is that from 1977 to 1980, Rabbi Hirsch served as a tank commander in the IDF in Israel. So you've you've got a lot. You've earned great respect for lots of great reasons, and for that, we should not be surprised that you're a leading voice on this topic, which is progressive Judaism and our connection, our commitment, our desire to be proud Zionists. I want to start with taking one step back and ask you to reflect a little bit, especially given where we are. Yesterday was yet another dark and trying day in the country. We've had a lot of those lately. And we have these moments that seem to be increasing in frequency of the serious nature of political and social issues in our country. And we care deeply about them as Jews. Some might say that Reform Judaism especially has a long tradition of being deeply engaged and committed to civic issues and fixing our secular society, the cracks that are there. How do we, as progressive Jews, put Israel in the mix with issues that seem to be so dire and so important, like violence, mass shootings, gun violence? Roe v. Wade is now seemingly to be overturned. These are not footnotes on the progressive agenda. These are the titles of the progressive agenda. Where does Israel fit into that conversation for us as progressive Jews when we have so many important pressing issues right in our lap?
Well, first of all, Rabbi Brown, thank you for asking me to be part of the Lunch and Learn, and greetings to Temple Israel in Akron. I hope the tornado warnings or the hurricane warnings, whatever you have there, I hope it dissipates. And it's good to be part of the program. And we have a saying in Hebrew, Acharon Acharon Chaviv, last. So I'm last in the program, but last and most beloved. So from my perspective, at least, I very much appreciate being with you. It is a very sad and tragic day, sadly and tragically in this country, increasingly so. You know, I was thinking for us as adults, really the prime responsibility we have as adults is to take care of our young, to take care of the children, both in terms of our own children, our own family and relatives, as well as the children of the country. And this failure to be able to do so should not only deeply trouble and sadden us, but should also be a very harsh warning sign that something is rotten in this country. This polarization and increasing hatred that we have amongst each other is manifesting in all kinds of various unhealthy ways, and should be a very harsh warning sign for us to really get our act together in this country. You know, you mentioned liberalism. I don't know the nature of the participants on this session, and I'm not aware of the demography or the political views of Temple Israel. We're part of a liberal movement. I serve a very prominent congregation, an important congregation named in memory of Rabbi Stephen Wise on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. It's not quite as hippy-dippy as its reputation was in the 1960s, but I think it's fair to say it's a bastion of liberalism, philosophical liberalism as well as political liberalism. And I myself have been a liberal for decades. I consider myself a liberal now, and we need to be deeply concerned not only about the polarization in this country, but about the issues that you mentioned that indicate a deterioration of the liberal standing in our country. That said, you know, it doesn't really, we need to make time for that, and we need to make time for Jewish issues. The fact that we care about Roe v. Wade and gun control, immigration, doesn't diminish our concern for Jews doesn't diminish our Jewish identity and doesn't and shouldn't diminish our concern for Israel. So like everything else in the world, we have to do everything at once and maintain not only our allegiance to each other, but our allegiance to the philosophical causes and political causes that influence and affect support for Israel as well in this country.
Thank you. I neglected to mention also for those who are joining us, please put questions in the Q&A. We're going to reserve time at the end, the last 10 or 15 minutes for any questions you have. So please feel free to do that while we're talking. So Israel's on the. We can't just be liberals, and we can't just be Jews. The two are in relationship with each other. One of the conflicts that I think we're experiencing, though, internally within the Jewish community is the question of why Israel should matter seems to also be on the table and not necessarily an obvious answer. I think I heard recently Daniel Hartman and Yossi Klein-Halevi share that there was a time in previous generations, much like we would say about anti-Semitism, where Zionism perhaps was obvious for Jews. We know not always, but certainly there was a period of time where to be Zionist was an obvious, simple, short answer. And it doesn't seem that is true, at least for every generation today. Can you explain a little bit as to why should Israel matter to me now in 2022? And do you think there's a difference between the generations as to why Israel matters?
Well, first of all, I'll give you several reasons why Israel should matter. Number one, the majority of the world's Jews either already live in Israel or will soon live in Israel. Already now, the majority of the world's Jews are born in Israel. Israel is increasingly the center of Jewish life, and there's something like 6.5 million Jews who live in Israel. So from that perspective alone, we should care deeply about our fellow Jews in Israel. But beyond that, as I said before, Israel will increasingly set the tone and the agenda for world Jewry. So whoever is not part of that, whoever separates themselves from the klal, and I mean not only us as individuals, but our movement, as you know, Rabbi Brown, I'm very concerned about some of the messages coming out of the centralized bodies of the Reform movement. Whoever separates themselves from Klal Yisrael, whoever separates themselves from the Jewish people, from the centrality of Jewish peoplehood, whoever says to themselves, there's 6.5 million Jews who are living in this part of the world, but we don't care, actually marginalizes themselves and puts into question their own future viability, as well as the very future of the existence of a liberal Jewish movement. So that's reason number one, that there are more Jews now who live in Israel than in the United States in all likelihood. If you measure who is a Jew in America by who says that I feel Jewish, I am Jewish, Judaism is important to me. The second reason, of course, is religious and historical ties. Everything about Judaism goes back to the period of the Bible and that 1,000-year period between, say, the monarchy, the rise of Saul and David and Solomon, and the eventual destruction and dispersion by the Romans in the year 70. All of Judaism came out of that period, but not only that, Western culture came out of that period. Christianity came out of that period. What became Islam came out of that period. And so we have religious and historical ties to that part of the world and to the collectivity that exists now in that part of the world. And so the next reason is this goes to the very heart and soul of what it means to be a Jew, is to render important the land of Israel and the people of Israel and the struggle for Jewish liberation and self-determination, like all other nations of the world, that progressives and liberals honor and fight for. And by the way, I just would add in connection of something you said before, Rabbi Brown, that Zionism is a liberal philosophy. It's a liberal cause. I'm a Zionist in part because I'm a liberal as well. So I would say, look, to any congregants who are listening, to any colleagues who are listening, I have spent some time, for example, at the Hebrew Union College, which is our rabbinical seminary. And from time to time, I've encountered students and colleagues who have said to me, listen, I'm an American rabbi. Israel means nothing to me. Why should I care? I would just say to the congregants who are listening here, if you come across a rabbi who says that, they don't really get the heart and soul of the Jewish people. There's something lacking in their emotional intelligence and resonance, and you want to move elsewhere.
So I want to go back a little bit to something you said. So can you tell us more about Zionism as a liberal cause? And I'll tell you why. I'll give one little thought that crosses my mind, which is in the American political context, I think, so I'm 42, so in my lifetime, it seems that a lot of people would say, well, Zionism is actually an issue that's on the conservative side of the agenda in American politics, that when Netanyahu came and spoke to the American Congress during the Obama administration, he made a political step to the right for Zionism, and that what do you mean, and why do you say that we should defend Zionism as a particularly liberal cause and not something that's either nonpartisan, as many Jewish organizations would say, or something that a lot of conservative, small c, conservative Jews in our congregations say proudly, I'm a proud conservative, in large part because I believe the conservative political agenda in America is better for Israel.
Well, you raised really important issues, and let's distinguish between the philosophy of Zionism, the values of Zionism, and the politics, contemporary politics today. So with respect to the values of Zionism, Zionism is all about the liberation of the Jewish people. This people that had been persecuted, oppressed, stripped of dignity for generations and centuries, that rose and on its own said to itself and to the world, the Jewish people deserve dignity like every other nation in contemporary life. And as these nationalisms around Europe were burgeoning and asserting collective self-determination, so Zionism, in the name of the Jewish people, asserted the same thing. It is a liberation movement for the Jewish people, and that's what liberals support, and that's what progressives support as well. It's one reason among many why I support the Palestinian cause too. I've always supported a two-state solution, and I still hope, although it's further from fruition than what looked like when I was at Arza 20 years ago, 25 years ago even, it looks like it's further away. I still support it, and I think that is where most of our movement is in terms of its liberal understanding of the world. That said, the issue of politics that you raised, Rabbi Brown, is a really important issue, and it is something noticeable and, frankly, from my perspective, quite troubling that it seems like, increasingly so, the strongest supporters of Israel we're losing this bipartisan consensus on Israel, and the stronger supporters of Israel tend to be conservatives. But that doesn't bother me. I'm happy for that. What bothers me is that we're losing part of the liberal world, what I suppose we characterize, or they characterize, as the progressive world. Although I'm not sure that's the best terminology. It is the left and the hard left of the American political scene. And we are increasingly, I think we are losing some of them increasingly. And I also believe that within the Jewish community, we are having some of these manifestations of a distancing from Israel within the Jewish community too, in particular in the younger generation. And that's deeply concerning. But that only means, and I've interpreted and personalized it in this way, that all the more is it incumbent on liberals, people like me, to push back against people in our general philosophical camp, against what I believe to be is a wrong-headed and at times animus filled perspective on Israel, which in some cases bleeds into downright anti-Semitism. To the extent that we're losing the bipartisan consensus more on the liberal side of the politics than the conservative side of the politics. For those who believe what I do, that imposes upon us a special obligation to push harder, to fight harder for Israel's cause, which is one reason why I tend to do it frequently, because I'm a liberal rabbi and I speak to liberal Jews.
How do we do that? What are the actions that we should be taking? Is it, and I ask that as a rabbi and as somebody, outside of being a rabbi. So, what is it, are we supposed to be putting Israel further in the forefront of our sermons and our topics? Is it more trips to Israel? Is it more of a conversation? Because that happens on a more regular, should we be talking about Israel more with pride? I know there've been, there was a time 5 or 6 years ago, I feel, that when there was it was noted that Israel was becoming even more of a partisan issue in America. I remember being advised, I don't remember by who, but there was advice being given to us as rabbis that we should be shifting our talk about Israel from political to personal, that we should have more falafel, talk more, in Hebrew, sing Israeli songs, go back to Israeli dancing in religious school, as opposed to talking about, Likud versus Meretz. That we had sort of turned too far into a political agenda in terms of our love was political with Israel and not enough in our kishkas and in our love of Israeli culture. Is that the answer? How do we do what you're saying?
Yes, and yes, and yes, and yes, and all that, and it's still not enough. The first thing I just want to just make a point about the politics of this. It is the case that the hard left is distancing from Israel. It is still the case that the majority of Americans are with Israel, the majority of American Jews are with Israel, pro-Israel, the majority of American liberal Jews are pro-Israel, the majority of the Democratic Party is still within that bipartisan consensus on Israel. So it is an issue that we have to look at carefully, but it is something that we shouldn't distort beyond its reasonable parameters. About Jewish education, look, and Israel education. There are really two forms of education, right? There's academic learning type of education, and that's important because in order to identify with anything, you need to know something, and to have a deep identity, you need to know a lot. So it goes without saying, there is widespread illiteracy about Israel, especially amongst liberal American Judaism. Part of that is because of emphasis, but part of that is because, look, I can give you our example here. We see our students, our young people, we see them 2 to 3 hours a week, okay? And we have a lot to teach them, not only about Israel. And so with a very limited amount of time that we have, and that parents are willing to give us in terms of bringing their children to us, we have self-imposed limitations on enriching their understanding about Israel, about Jewish history, how much of our history is connected to that part of the world, and our religious obligations towards each other. So, we do the best we can. It's not only synagogues that should be doing this, the other two main institutions of American Jewish life that build Jewish identity, Jewish day schools, and most importantly for us, summer camps. They year after year, summer after summer of doing this, would be very important. And book learning, knowledge, information is of itself. First of all, there's a concept in Judaism of Torah Lishma, study for the sake of study. That's important, but also study for the sake of utilitarian purposes of knowing who you are and what you identify with. It's important just to know, and there's widespread Jewish illiteracy across the board within American Jewry. The second way that we educate and that we learn is, of course, experiential learning. And I cannot emphasize enough, I pioneered these trips to Israel. When I was at ARTSA, Rabbi Brown, you mentioned that I served in ARTSA for 12 years. When I was in ARTSA, it was very important to me to establish a travel department. So I don't know if you yourself traveled through ARTSA Travel, but we named the travel department ARTSA Travel, and I designed trips, missions that I thought were important for Reform synagogues and Reform Jews to experience Israel. That's an opportunity to instill an emotional understanding of what this miracle of 20th and 21st century Judaism is all about. And there are things primarily emotionally that we absorb by being in Israel that we simply cannot in any other place in the world. And so that too is very important. But I must say, this is my own opinion. It's supported by some empirical data. Not everyone agrees, but my general opinion is the relationship between Israel and world Jewry is a function and a reflection of the intensity of Jewish identity amongst world Jewry. That is, it is true that many American Jews oppose this or that Israeli policy. By the way, that's completely legitimate, completely appropriate to express such criticism, to be active in trying to change Israeli policies. And it's even desirable because all of Judaism is based on argumentation and debate, and the fundamentals of democracy are the same. It's all about creating public space in the public arena to argue it out and to have the best arguments, the most persuasive evidence prevail. And so there's nothing wrong and everything right in criticizing this or that Israeli policy. But I think, and as I said, I think there's some empirical data to support this, that the disagreement that we, and in particular in the liberal camp, may have with Israeli policy, say on the use of force or on the Palestinian issue, only has a marginal impact on the distancing between American Jewry and Israel. And I would include in that the issue of religious pluralism as well, and say the Western Wall compromise, which I worked on, by the way, and I was part of. But these things are only marginally influential in terms of the distancing of American Jewry, and in particular liberal American Jewry, with Israel. The most important factor in my mind is the intensity of Jewish identity in America. And we are losing that the intensity of that identity in America. And as we lose that, a reflection of that is identification with Israel, and then we become more distanced with Israel as well. Hello. Hello. Are we back? We're back.
Can you try to turn your camera on again?
I get the same icon. It's you
Okay,
can't.
let me hold on. Let me fix it again. Yep.
Not yet.
All right, try now. Let's see. There we go. Sorry, I swear that never happens. Of course it happened. Hopefully it will not
It's
happen again.
it's the tornadoes you're going through now.
That's the truth.
Now, what was he saying about 10 minutes ago?
Yeah, so you were on quite a roll. It was great talking about, I had all sorts of questions for you.
I convinced myself. You guys weren't listening, but it was pretty convincing to me.
That's right. Well, I saw there was somebody who had posted a question, I believe. But I think you need to repost because it started over. So if you posted a question, please repost your question.
Let me just say, let me just summarize because I don't know what you heard, and I'm happy to go back. But the point I was making is that this or that Israeli policy, and I suppose I don't know if I cut off before I said, I was completely legitimate to criticize Israeli policies. That's what we do. That's what democracies do. That's what Jews do. But our liberals tend to have a much more difficult time with the use of force, and we would have different approach to how to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. And all of that is legitimate. That's all appropriate. That's all welcome, because that's the basis of American culture, democratic culture, and Jewish culture. We argue with each other. That said, the primary factor in my mind, which is causing a distancing between American Judaism and Israel, is not all of that. Those issues, and I also would add the religious pluralism issue, the issue of the Western Wall, which I was part of, and I was actually involved in that. Those are important issues. They do affect some American Jews, in particular the leadership core. But the main reason why, to the extent that there is a distancing between American Judaism and Israel, is because American Jews have less Jewish intensity. Because identification with Israel is a reflection of identification with Judaism. And as identification with Judaism weakens and dilute, so too, of course, identification with Israel will equally, will unfold in parallel. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that, to the extent that American Jewry is diluting its relationship with Jewry, that the American Jewish community is diluting its relationship with Israel. All the more reason, by the way, to inject a sense of urgency into Jewish literacy, but also Israel's role in helping us sustain Jewish continuity in the United States.
So I see we have a couple questions I promise we'll get to in a moment from people who are watching. But on that topic though, okay, so we have some work to do educationally and perhaps even outside of education, just in terms of Jewish passion for Judaism and Jewish passion, therefore, for Zionism. But so here's a challenge that I see that comes up, and I agree with you, that we often find in the American context today that for a variety of reasons that a Jewish person in America today, their level of commitment to Judaism, we might value it as they are less committed than perhaps their grandparents were. It's less a part of their life if you were to make a pie chart out of how they spend their time. Lots of reasons for that, and I say that non-judgmentally. But what sometimes comes up is they're deeply committed to general secular knowledge, particularly, let's say, the New York Times, to be specific. So they're getting there, where they are highly educated is on current events. And we're getting our news from sources that traditionally we've trusted. And maybe I learn more about Israel from the New York Times than I do from my rabbi or my synagogue. What do I do with that? Is that a trusted source? Not just the New York Times. I use that as an example because it's seen as the hub of liberalism, but also, you know, you're in New York and we're in Reform synagogues, and we have subscriptions to hundreds of different things on our phones these days that give us all sorts of headlines. How do we know what to trust, and should we be particularly critiquing what has been called by many the liberal media? Is that a real issue?
Well, look, the bargain we made, and we insist on this, is that we are part of the world. We embrace Western philosophy. We synthesize Judaism with Western values. And in many respects, if you study this deeply, you'll see that Jewish values informed Western values. And that's one of the reasons why we do so well in environments of freedom and democracy. And so, quite right, we should be involved in all of the issues of our world. We're American citizens, and we should be involved in American society. And we should glean our information from, you know, the highest educational academies where our students excel, our children excel, and from media outlets. Of course, it goes without saying. The trends that are affecting American society in general are also affecting the central establishments of American society, including the media. And so what we are seeing is an increasingly polarized media where people essentially take sides. Those who are liberal listen to and absorb only liberal media, and those who are conservative, and you know, and the two never meet, which is catastrophic for democracy, by the way, and for unity, for national unity, which doesn't mean national uniformity, that everybody agrees on the same thing all the time, but it is catastrophic for national unity, for a sense of common purpose. So it goes without saying that we should be involved in all of these central institutions of American life, including the media. And how can you be an informed American citizen if you don't know the news and don't read the news and don't listen to the news? So we should, and we should read the other side too. Before I start my day, at home I've got maybe 7 or 8 different media outlets, and I read some of the most conservative outlets. I'm a little embarrassed that somebody's might track me, you know, and oh man, he reads these very conservative outlets, and I do so because I just want to know what they're saying. It's important, I think, and so it's important to read the other side and not be siloed. All of that said, every media outlet nowadays, and the New York Times historically, had a certain perspective on the world, and they understand the world and report the news from that perspective. And it is I wouldn't say it's an anti-Israel perspective, but it's not a Zionist perspective. It's not our perspective. I have no issue whatsoever that our people are reading the New York Times. To the contrary, I read the New York Times every single day. It is still the paper of record, no matter what everybody else criticizes and whatever else is out there. I can't conceive of understanding what's going on in the world without reading the New York Times. But the problem is, and what I have said, Rabbi Brown, and maybe you're alluding to this, is American Jews tend to get their understanding of Judaism from the New York Times, rather than and in the place of Rabbi Brown from Temple Israel, or Rabbi Hirsch from Stephen Wise. And that's problematic for us, both not only with respect to Israel, also with respect to Israel, but it's problematic to us because it gives our people a false understanding of the key values of Judaism, and we can't break out of it because we're siloed into one perspective all the time. So that's the issue with the New York Times. But if you were to ask me, should I subscribe to the New York Times? Absolutely, you should subscribe to the New York Times. It's a paper of record. But when it comes to what does Judaism say about something, consult with Rabbi Brown too.
I'll take that endorsement. Thank you. I want to share David's question online. He says, I agree that Zionism is a liberal cause. However, anti-Zionism, in my opinion, has clearly gained dominance as a progressive cause, facilitated by the explication of intersectionality. The BLM charter adopts anti-Zionism. BDS founders and BDS are anti-Zionist. Recent proposals for California are anti-Zionist. The congressional squad is anti-Israel. How can a liberal continue as a progressive? I think it's calling into question, at what point do I say, you know what, this is too much? I'm so committed to Zionism and Israel, and I see too many people who are my allies on the left. They've gone too far. I have to leave the left.
Yeah, no, listen, I agree with many of those observations. I make a distinction between liberals and leftism. I do not consider what we might characterize the hard left today, the hard progressives in the Democratic Party or left of the Democratic Party. I don't consider them in many respects liberals. They're leftists, but they're not liberals, because liberals believe in tolerance and acceptance and free speech and free debate. We don't try to shut down debate. We evaluate people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And so all philosophies, all political ideologies that reject those values can hardly be called liberal. They're not liberal. They're something else. We're liberals. But I do agree that the elements of the left are not only critical of Israel, some of them are reject the very idea and right of Israel to exist at all. And much of that seeps into anti-Semitism. I'm happy to get into the discussion of is anti-Zionism always anti-Semitism or not, but that's not really the point. The point is with some of these racial theories, and with respect to BDS, for example, if those who advocate not for changing Israeli policy, but that Israel was born in original sin, it has no right to exist, that is anti-Semitic, because we define ourselves as a people. It's not for others to define Jews and based on their definition to decide whether they want to accept us or not. All they're entitled to do is to understand how we define ourselves and then to decide whether they're willing to accept us or not. And if they're not willing to accept Jewish national aspirations, which are as old as the Bible itself, then that philosophy denies and rejects the central ways that Jews define themselves, and it often leads to very troubling anti-Semitic ideas and actions. So it's one thing to be critical of Israel. We need to embrace those people and bring them into the camp. Nobody should get confused about BDS. BDS is not a philosophy that's critical of Israel. And if you ask them, they won't even hide it. They'll tell you, those of you who have children and grandchildren in university, you tell your grandchildren to go up to the BDS, the Palestine from the river to the sea people, the apartheid Israel people who throw these apartheid weeks once a year on campus. You tell your children and your grandchildren, go up to these BDS people and ask them, do you believe that Israel has a right to exist? And they won't hide, the ones who are educated and are real advocates of BDS, they won't hide their view. Their view is no, Israel has no right to exist. That's when the debate really can't continue from our perspective. I mean, it's fine. We need to struggle with them. We need to oppose them. We need to marshal forces against them. But this idea that we're going to engage in some kind of pluralistic debate about whether I have a right to exist or not, it's not where we should be spending our time. We should be spending our time shoring up those who are still persuadable and bringing them closer to the position that we want them to have on a political level.
So we have an in-person question here from Marty. Go ahead, Marty.
I was brought to bring this subject up rather than just keeping it to myself. I've been thinking about this for decades already, and I decided to finally bring it up with Rabbi Brown and our social action committee here, and some of your own writings, Rabbi Hirsch, were instrumental in prompting us to want to have you speak with us. We ended up titling our program, "Is Anti-Zionism Anti-Semitism?" ? Just recently, the Harvard Crimson student newspaper, whose staff will go on to assume major leadership roles in this country on the basis of what their predecessors have done. You work for the Harvard Crimson, you'll probably end up at the New York Times and the Washington Post, and a member of Congress, and boards of major organizations and in politics. And these people matter. They came out supporting BDS in an editorial, and essentially, without saying it specifically in black and white, that Israel should not exist. They also went on to say, we are not anti-Semitic, because anti-Semitism has such a bad connotation. So they decided for themselves, what is anti-Semitism? They said no, but to me, that's anti-Zionism. And it gets back to the fundamental question of our whole program. And it's a yes/no question. Is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? So that's why I ask of you a yes/no answer.
So look, if I were to have a theoretical conversation, in the classroom, I would say not necessarily. After all, there are a lot of anti-Zionist Jews. And some supporters of fierce critics of Israel believe that they are criticizing Israeli policy and they are not challenging the right of Israel to exist. But in practice, first of all, BDS is not that. BDS knows exactly what they're doing. They have BDS stands for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. They want to boycott Israel. They have very little influence on the economic level, but that's actually, Israel is doing better than ever. The Israeli economy is terrific. And some sectors in the Israeli economy are cutting edge world leaders, like the high-tech sector, this computer security sector, the biotechnological sector, and so on. But opponents and enemies of Israel who support BDS do so not because they expect to undermine the Israeli economy. What they are trying to do, with some success, is to undermine Israel's standing, to strip it from any kind of moral or political legitimacy. And that's the real danger. And to the extent that they are roping in some of our own children One, that is an indication of the failure of the American Jewish establishment, all of us, every single one of us, in educating our children. And two, it's a worrying sign for the future because, as you said, many of these graduates of elite universities are going to be the leaders of key institutions in the United States. So again, I could have a theoretical conversation where I could accept a position that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, but in practice, it often is. And with respect to some of the anti-Zionists, like the BDS folks and their supporters, it usually is. And it often spills into downright anti-Semitism that nobody would argue with is not anti-Semitic. For example, there were just, I think last week or just several days ago, there was another case. It happened first about a year ago when Israel and Hamas were fighting the war last year, where diners in Los Angeles were attacked by pro-Palestinian advocates because they looked Jewish to them. And they actually went around and asked, "Are you Jewish? Are you Jewish?" And then, made a scene and assaulted verbally and even physically people. We have these cases in New York. Somebody who was walking the streets with a kippah, or somebody who looks outwardly Jewish, is often attacked by pro-Palestinian advocates. So the environment, even if you were to have a philosophical debate, is this thought or that thought by definition automatically anti-Semitic? In a sense, it's beside the point if it leads to inspiring people towards animosity towards Jews and anti-Semitic actions themselves. But nobody would argue are not anti-Semitic.
So my follow-up to that is a debate we've been having in some of our discussions around that issue, which is, so how worried are you about anti-Semitism in that? How worried should we be? Is this, some people shrug this off and they say, look, there are going to be people out there who are anti-Semitic. They shrug it off and say there are people out there who are always going to be anti-Israel. And then the other side would say we should be deeply concerned about the increase in anti-Semitism, the anti-Zionism, all of the above. Where do you stand on the spectrum there, and where should we be?
I don't think America is turning into Nazi Germany or some of the worst parts of Europe or the Pale of Settlement or Russia or Ukraine. I think there's something very basic about American society, its openness, its pluralism, built into its very constitutional framework that provides some buffer that distinguishes it from state-sponsored anti-Semitism historically in other parts of the world, and that are still pervasive. I don't think America is ever going to be like France, for example, where Jews, many Jews live in fear every day. Now that said, I do think we all know it's an increasing problem. The studies bear this out. I think the ADL just came out with a survey that said there was a 100% rise in the last few years in anti-Semitic incidences. Even one anti-Semitic incident should concern us. It is connected, by the way, anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish activity, Jew hatred. They are, we're so often the canary in the mine. We're so often the barometer of the health of a society. So when anti-Semitic incidences rise, it is often, I would say usually the case that it's reflective of something rotten in the state that is increasingly becoming worrying and rotten. And we see that for sure, definitely. Jews are not the only people who are attacked in this country, but it's connected. This rise in anti-Semitism is connected to a decrease of tolerating one another in general and tolerating each other's differences. So I do think we should be worried. We should be extremely worried about here, 24 hours after the Texas massacre. I think we should be extremely worried about the rising hate in this country, the acts of violence in this country that is connected to Jew hatred and anti-Semitism, but we also need to be aware that anti-Semitism is a unique phenomenon that has been with the world for centuries. It is an ineradicable virus. And for us, what that means is we need to be proficient in identifying what anti-Semitism is. And to the extent that some of our Jews, and increasingly young Jews, can't even identify that anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, BDS, Israel is apartheid, Palestine from the river to the sea. They can't even identify what constitutes anti-Semitism, an attack on their own people, on their own culture. That is deeply distressing. And we need to get our act together in the Jewish community.
Well, thank you. I want to close with we have 2 minutes left, and I'll keep us to time. There are 2 questions that were posed in the chat, so I'll share them quickly. And if you're able to answer them quickly, great. If not, maybe we'll have you back again. Okay, so the 2 questions are, the first is, can you speak to the Parent Circle Family Forum and the book, A Paragon by Colin McCann? I don't know, that's an on-the-spot question, so you can decide if that's something you're
I don't even know what that is, Rabbi Brown.
I don't either, actually. Maybe Marty or anybody knows. So we'll pass on that question. We're sorry.
Question next time, invite me.
The next question is, I'd like to know what books you would recommend on Zionism and the history of the state of Israel, especially for people who are political liberals or not well read in these subjects. So that's a great closing question. If we want to learn more and we want to go in depth on our own education, where would you lead people?
First of all, I would just understanding the Zionist movement. The all-time classic book is The Zionist Reader by Arthur Hertzberg. I would definitely read that. Those are snippets. Often they're translated from the original German, so it's really, really important, and it's fairly rare material. I would read that. I would read Herzl's writings. I would read the new Zionist Reader that academic from Canada named Gil Troy published about 1.5 years ago or so. So I would read that. If you want to read one book that gives you a snapshot of why the Israeli-Palestinian dispute is not yet resolved, read a book called The War of Return by a former Israeli liberal Knesset member from the Labor Party, Einat Wilf, W-I-L-F, and she wrote it with, I think, an academic named Adi Schwartz. If you read one book about the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, read that book, and that kind of puts in context, at least from the Israeli perspective, not from the Palestinian perspective. If you want to know what they viewed, you have to read their books. But that'll put in from a liberal perspective how liberal Zionists understand the current obstacles to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. So I would start with that.
So it's Einat. The last one was by Einat Wilf. What's the title?
Einat, E-I-N-A-T, and W-I-L-F, and the title is The War of Return.
The War of Return. Oh, I want to thank you for your time and your thoughtfulness and your desire and will and ambition to go be a voice of leadership for us. I think if we had, I had a lot of questions. We could have gone into a lot more, but I would say one of the great challenges that I find we're facing is much like how you began. We're at such a polarized political time, and a lot of us, I think, are exhausted by it. And when Israel becomes a point of contention, common response that I've seen and perhaps even felt is, I'm going to put Israel in the margins. I don't want another topic that I have to debate and that I have to disagree with my friends on, and it's going to divide me from the people who I am allies and care about, and my neighbors. So I don't need another divisive issue. So I put it in the margins. And I think a lot of what you've shared with us is that is not what we, especially as Jews, but I would broaden it to our friends and allies too. It need not be in the margins. We need to be having this discussion. We need to do our own work. our homework and read and listen and learn and be able to speak with our friends about Israel as an important topic so that it's not marginalized for us, but also so that we can go into depth on it because it has complexities and it is a liberal cause. So I appreciate you saying that. Thank you so much for your time. It's great to get to know you. Hopefully this will not be the last time that our congregations come to meet. And we wish you the best. We'll continue to listen to your voice.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Brown. Thank you to Temple Israel and any of you who come to our area of the world on Shabbat, come and pray with us.
And say a quick word about your podcast. Plug your podcast. I'll give you that lead.
Started podcasts. We got this fascinating podcast now that just came out with an Egyptian who was raised to be a jihadist, who became a Zionist and a fluent Hebrew speaker and an Israel supporter. You got to listen to that. And then coming up, we've already recorded an additional 2. The next one is with Natan Sharansky, and the one after that is with a woman who's a real social justice warrior and social media warrior, a woman named Eve Barlow of the younger generation. And we've got Minister Shai from the Israeli Minister of Diaspora Affairs. So we've got a whole host of great programs. I would appreciate it if you do listen to those podcasts, because that's the new medium that we want to try and reach people at. So thank you for.
Tell us the name of the podcast again. What should people search?
It's called In These Times with Rabbi Hirsch.
We'll be there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.